You ever get that feeling when you're alone, but something just doesn't feel right? Like someone, or something, is watching you. Yeah, that's how it all began. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Mark, and what I'm about to tell you isn't some made-up ghost story. This is real. It all started when I found that diary. The day was typical, nothing special. I was back home for the summer, staying with my grandparents in a small, forgotten town somewhere in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, except for the secrets buried deep beneath the surface, the ones nobody talks about. It was on one of those lazy afternoons when I stumbled across something strange. My grandparents have this massive attic full of old dusty junk they've collected over the years, and as usual, curiosity got the better of me. I was sifting through boxes when I found it, a diary. Its cover was black, faded, and the pages looked ancient, like something that didn't belong in this century. The strange part, it had a lock, but no key. There was something about that diary that instantly hooked me. I can't explain it, but I felt like it was calling to me, whispering, telling me to open it. That's when things started to get weird. I managed to force the lock open with an old screwdriver, and the second I did, I felt this cold chill sweep through the attic. You know that feeling when the temperature drops so fast, it sends goosebumps crawling up your arms? That's exactly what happened. But I wasn't scared, not yet. I was curious. The first page wasn't written in English. It wasn't even in a language I could recognize. But the more I stared at it, the more the words started to make sense. Like my brain was piecing it together on its own. And then just like that, I understood every word. To the one who finds this, you are now part of a legacy far older than you can imagine. The bloodline must continue, and the power must remain within. But beware, for the power comes at a cost. I remember my heart pounding in my chest as I read the last line. I wanted to stop. I should have stopped, but something inside me just couldn't let go. I kept reading, page after page, and that's when the nightmares began. Every night after that, I dreamt of them. Shadows moving in the corners of my vision, figures with glowing red eyes. And then, there was her. Her name was Lilith. She appeared in every dream, always watching, always waiting. At first, she was distant, like a shadow on the edge of my mind. But as the nights passed, she came closer. Each time, her pale face became clearer, and I could see her sharp, blood-red lips curled into a smile that never reached her eyes. Lilith wasn't just a figment of my imagination. She was real. I could feel it in my bones. The diary, it was hers. Question to the audience. Before I go any further, tell me, have you ever found something that felt cursed? Something that felt like it wasn't meant to be touched? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories. One night, the dream was different. I wasn't just watching anymore. I was in it. I was standing in the middle of a dark forest, the trees twisted and gnarled like the hands of some forgotten monster. The air was thick, hard to breathe, and the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves. Or so I thought. But then I heard her. Her voice, soft like a whisper, calling my name. Mark, you've come so far. It's time to finish what we started. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. But something was wrong. The room was too quiet, too still. And that's when I noticed. The diary wasn't where I left it. It was on the nightstand, open to a page I hadn't read before. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. The words seemed to burn into my mind on their own. They are watching. They are waiting. You can't escape. At that moment, I knew. This wasn't just the book. It was a doorway, a link to something far darker and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. But the worst part, I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it. Something was in the room with me, hiding in the shadows just out of sight. Over the next few days, things got worse. I would hear footsteps in the hallway at night, but every time I checked, no one was there. Lights flickered, doors creaked open on their own, and there was this constant feeling of being watched. One night, as I was lying in bed, the room plunged into total darkness. I heard it again, her voice. "You can't run, Mark. You belong to us now." I jumped out of bed, my pulse pounding in my ears, and ran downstairs. My grandparents were asleep. Everything seemed normal. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I wasn't dreaming. This was real. That's when I realized I had to get rid of the diary. But it wasn't that simple. Every time I tried to throw it away, burn it, or even leave it behind, it somehow found its way back to me. It was like it had a mind of its own. You see, the thing is, the diary wasn't just a book. It was alive, and it had a purpose. It wasn't just about Lilith. It was about all of them. The vampires, the bloodline, the power. Now you might think vampires are just myths, stories told to scare children, but they're real. They've been hiding in plain sight for centuries, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what's theirs. And that's where I come in. I'm not the first person to find the diary. I won't be the last. But I've uncovered something they didn't want me to know. Something that could change everything. But I can't do it alone. So what do you think? Should I keep digging? Or is this a nightmare better left buried? Let me know in the comments. And while you're at it, hit that like button if you've ever felt like you're being watched. Because trust me, you're not imagining it. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I felt her presence, lurking just beyond the veil of sleep. And it wasn't just Lilith anymore. I could feel them, others. They were watching me, waiting for me to slip, waiting for me to fall under their control. But I wasn't about to let that happen. Not yet. The next morning, I decided to get out of the house, clear my head. Maybe, just maybe, if I stayed away from the diary long enough, I could shake this nightmare off. I drove into town, found a small diner, and sat in the corner with a cup of coffee that I barely touched. My hands were shaking. I kept looking around, expecting to see someone watching me through the window. But the truth is, I wasn't paranoid. I was being watched. That's when I met her, Emily. She sat at the table across from me, her eyes sharp, focused. She wasn't from around here. You could tell just by looking at her. Everything about her screamed outsider. But there was something else about her, something that made me uneasy, and yet I couldn't look away. "You're Mark, right?" Her voice was low, steady, like she already knew the answer. I froze. How did she know my name? I had never seen her before in my life. Before I could ask, she leaned in closer and said, "You're in danger. They're coming for you." My blood ran cold. How could she know? And I hadn't told anyone about the diary, about the dreams, about Lilith. But Emily, she knew. "Who are you?" I finally managed to ask. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out the window, like she was expecting someone, or something, to appear at any moment. Then she turned back to me and whispered, "I've been following you ever since you opened the diary." My heart skipped a beat. Why? What do you want from me? Emily glanced around the diner, making sure no one was listening, and then leaned in even closer. Her voice was barely a whisper now. "I don't want anything from you, Mark. I'm trying to help you." Help me? I didn't believe her. not for a second. But I also knew that I didn't have many options. If she knew about the diary, then maybe she knew how to get rid of it, how to stop this nightmare. "How do you know about the diary?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated just for a moment, then said, "Because I've been where you are. I found it too, years ago, and it nearly killed me." The room seemed to spin for a second. She found it. She went through this too. But if that was true, then how was she still here? How was she still alive? "Why didn't it kill you?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Emily's eyes darkened, and she looked down at her hands. "Because I gave it what it wanted." That sent a chill down my spine. What does it want?" Emily didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, worn notebook. She slid it across the table to me. "Read this," she said. "It'll explain everything." I looked down at the notebook, hesitant to touch it. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I opened it and flipped through the pages. They were filled with strange symbols, ancient writings, and sketches of creatures with glowing red eyes and sharp fangs. But one phrase stood out, written over and over again in bold, angry letters: "The bloodline must continue." I looked up at Emily, my hands shaking. "What does this mean?" She sighed and leaned back in her chair. "The vampires, Mark, they're real." "You're part of the bloodline," she interrupted, her voice firm. "Your ancestors were connected to them. That's why the diary called to you. That's why they're after you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Vampires, bloodlines. It sounded like something out of a bad horror movie, but the look in Emily's eyes told me that she wasn't joking. She was dead serious. "How do I stop them?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily looked at me with a mixture of pity and fear. "You don't. You can't. The only way out is to run. But even then, they'll find you eventually." I felt the walls closing in around me. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I couldn't run. Not now. Not after everything I had seen. I leaned forward, my voice steady. "I'm not running. I'm going to fight." Emily shook her head. "You don't understand, Mark. You can't fight them. They're too... How do I find him?" Emily reached into her bag again and pulled out an old, tattered map. She spread it out on the table and pointed to a spot deep in the mountains. "This is where he was last seen. If he's still alive, he'll be there." I stared at the map, my mind racing. The mountains were miles away, isolated and dangerous, but if this keeper was my only chance, I had to take it. "When do we leave?" I asked, looking up at Emily. She shook her head. "I can't go with you. I have my own demons to face." I opened my mouth to argue, but she cut me off. "This is your journey, Mark. You have to face them on your own." I felt a wave of dread wash over me, but I nodded. I had no choice. "Good luck," she said, standing up from the table. "And remember, trust no one." With that, she turned and walked out of the diner, leaving me alone with the map and the weight of what was coming. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the map Emily had left me. The diner had grown quieter, with only a few scattered customers left. But I barely noticed. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of everything. Vampires, bloodlines, the keeper. It all seemed too unreal. But after what I had experienced, I knew I couldn't just dismiss it. I stuffed the map into my jacket pocket and headed out of the diner, my mind racing. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the streets. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every person I passed, every shadow I saw from the corner of my eye, sent chills down my spine. I needed to get out of town, now. I headed straight for my car and sped off. The further I got from town, the quieter it became. Soon I was on a deserted highway, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the occasional howl of wind through the trees. I kept glancing at the map, trying to figure out how long it would take to reach the mountains. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the darkness seemed to close in around me. That's when I noticed something. Lights in my rearview mirror. Headlights. I hadn't seen another car for miles, but now there was someone behind me, keeping pace. My heart started to race. Was it them? The vampires? Or was it just some random driver on the same road? I pressed down on the gas pedal, hoping to put some distance between us, but the car behind me sped up as well. Whoever it was, they weren't going to let me go that easily. My mind flashed back to Emily's warning. Trust no one. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. I couldn't let them catch me, not now. Not when I was so close to finding answers. Up ahead, I spotted a narrow side road that led into the woods. Without thinking, I swerved the car onto the dirt road, the tires kicking up dust and gravel. The headlights behind me disappeared for a moment, but then they reappeared, following me down the path. Panic surged through me. I couldn't outrun them forever. My only hope was to lose them in the trees. The road twisted and turned, getting narrower with each passing mile. Branches scraped against the sides of my car, and the headlights behind me flickered as they dodged obstacles. Just when I thought I was about to reach a dead end, I spotted an old wooden bridge up ahead, spanning a narrow ravine. Without hesitation, I floored the gas and sped towards the bridge. The car behind me did the same, closing the gap between us. As I crossed the bridge, I felt a sharp jolt, like something had struck the back of my car. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the vehicle slam into the side of the bridge, skidding to a stop just inches from the edge. The headlights flickered, then went out, leaving the road behind me in complete darkness. I didn't stop to see who had been chasing me. I kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest, until I was far from the bridge and deep into the woods. Eventually, the road led me to a small, abandoned cabin, nestled among the trees. I pulled over and shut off the engine, trying to catch my breath. The cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Boards were missing from the windows, and the roof sagged in places. But it would have to do for now. I needed to regroup, figure out my next move. I stepped out of the car and approached the cabin cautiously. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, eerie sound, almost like a distant whisper. Pushing open the creaky door, I stepped inside. The interior was just as run down as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. On the floor, near the fireplace, was a circle of symbols drawn in ash. It looked like some kind of ritual. But who had performed it, and why? Suddenly, a voice from behind me broke the silence. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Standing in the doorway was an old man, his face lined with age, but his eyes sharp and alert. He wore a tattered coat and leaned on a cane, but there was something about him, something powerful. "Who are you?" I asked, taking a step back. The old man narrowed his eyes. "I'm the one you've been looking for, the Keeper." For a moment, I couldn't believe it. This was him, the one Emily had told me about. He didn't look like much, but there was a presence about him, something that made me feel both relieved and terrified at the same time. "How did you know I was coming?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The Keeper chuckled softly. "I've known for a long time. The diary, it always leads people to me. Sooner or later. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Then you know what's happening to me. You know how to stop them? The keeper's expression grew serious. He hobbled over to the fireplace and sat down in an old wooden chair. I know what you've seen. I know what's hunting you. But stopping them, that's another matter entirely. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. So there's no way out. The keeper shook his head. There's always a way, but it won't be easy, and it won't come without a price. I didn't like the sound of that. But at this point, I didn't have many options. What do I have to do? The old man looked into the flames, his eyes distant, as if he were remembering something long forgotten. You have to face them, the vampires. You have to confront the bloodline that runs through your veins. Only then will you be free. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. And how do I do that? The keeper turned to me, his eyes piercing through the dim light. You'll need to summon them. I felt a chill run down my spine at his words. Summon them. The very idea made my blood run cold. Summon them? I repeated, my voice shaking slightly. Are you serious? Why would I bring them to me? The keeper leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. Because they're already looking for you. They can sense your presence, your connection to their bloodline. Running won't save you, but summoning them, that gives you control. It's your only chance. I stared at him, my mind racing. This was madness. But then again, so was everything that had happened in the last few days. Emily's cryptic messages, the mysterious diary, the shadows that followed me. I was already in too deep to turn back now. All right, I said slowly. How do I do it? How do I summon them? The keeper's face was unreadable. He stood up slowly, as if the weight of his years pressed down on him, and shuffled over to a dusty old bookshelf. After a few moments of searching, he pulled out a worn, leather-bound book. It was ancient, its pages yellowed with age, and the cover was embossed with strange symbols that I couldn't decipher. This, he said, handing me the book, contains the ritual. But be warned, it's not something to be taken lightly. The ritual will call them to you, but once they arrive, they will test you. They will push you to your limits, and if you fail... He didn't need to finish the sentence. I could already imagine the consequences. I took the book from his hands, feeling its heavy weight in my grip. What do I need to prepare? The keeper gestured to the symbols drawn in ash on the floor. You'll need to recreate these markings. They are ancient, designed to bind the vampires to this place, so they cannot harm you, at least not directly. Not directly, I asked, my heart skipping a beat. He nodded gravely. They'll test your mind, your resolve. They'll play with your fears, your deepest insecurities. If you falter, well, let's just say they won't need to harm you physically. I swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in my throat. And what happens if I succeed? The keeper's eyes darkened. Then you'll have their power. But remember this, power always comes with a price. The next few hours were a blur. I followed the keeper's instructions to the letter, meticulously recreating the symbols on the cabin floor, using ash from the fireplace. The old man watched me in silence, occasionally offering a few words of advice, but mostly staying out of my way. When the markings were complete, I sat down in the center of the circle, the old leather-bound book resting in my lap. My hands were shaking as I flipped through its pages, reading the incantation I was supposed to recite. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, but they felt ancient, powerful. As I began to speak the words aloud, The air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier, thicker. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and the fire in the hearth flickered wildly. It felt as though the very walls of the cabin were closing in around. Suddenly, the room grew deathly silent. The wind stopped, the fire went out, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I looked up from the book, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I saw them. Standing in the doorway of the cabin were 3 figures, shrouded in darkness. Their eyes glowed a deep crimson, and their pale skin seemed to shimmer in the dim light. They were beautiful, in a terrifying way, otherworldly, like something out of a nightmare. One of them, a tall woman with long, flowing black hair, stepped forward, her eyes locked on mine. "You summoned us," she said, her voice smooth as silk, but there was a coldness in it that made my skin crawl. "Do you know what that means?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, and my heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. The woman smiled, revealing sharp, glistening fangs. "It means you belong to us now." For what felt like an eternity, the vampires circled me, their eyes never leaving mine. They didn't speak, but I could feel their presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. My mind was racing, trying to remember what the Keeper had told me. "They'll test your fears, your insecurities." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. The woman laughed, a soft, haunting sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, darling," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "You should be." Suddenly, the room around me shifted, warping into something unrecognizable. The walls of the cabin melted away, replaced by towering black trees and a thick fog that seemed to swallow everything in sight. The air was cold, biting at my skin, and the ground beneath my feet was soft and wet, like mud. I was no longer in the cabin. I was in the forest, the same forest from my nightmares. The woman appeared before me, her eyes glowing in the darkness. "This is your fear," she whispered, her voice echoing all around me. "This is where it begins." I turned in circles, trying to get my bearings, but the fog was too thick. I could barely see a few feet in front of me. And then, out of the mist, came a figure, Emily. She stumbled toward me, her face pale and bloodied. "Help me!" she gasped, reaching out a trembling hand. "Please, you have to help me!" I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. This couldn't be real. Emily was dead. I had seen her die with my own eyes. But she kept coming closer, her eyes wide with fear and pain. "You promised," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You promised you'd save me." I shook my head, backing away from her. No, this isn't real. You're not real." But Emily's face twisted in agony, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. "You lied to me!" she shrieked. "You let me die!" Suddenly, she lunged at me, her hands wrapping around my throat. I struggled, gasping for breath, but her grip was like iron. I could feel the life draining out of me, my vision blurring as darkness closed in around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The forest vanished, replaced by the cabin once more. I was lying on the floor, gasping for breath, my heart racing. The vampires stood over me, watching in silence. The woman knelt down beside me, her cold fingers brushing against my cheek. "Do you understand now?" she whispered. "Do you see what happens when you face your fears?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was reeling, my body trembling with exhaustion and terror. The woman stood up, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "This is only the beginning," she said. "There is much more to come." The woman's words echoed in my head, reverberating through the very walls of the cabin. There is much more to come. But I could barely think. I was consumed by the terror of what had just happened. Emily, my Emily, had attacked me, even though I knew she was dead. Or at least, she should be dead. The vampires were testing me, just like the Keeper had warned. They were pulling my mind apart, dragging my deepest fears to the surface, but why? What was their end game? The woman stood over me, a smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Are you ready for the next test?" she asked, her voice a haunting melody. I shook my head, struggling to find my voice. "Why are you doing this? What do you want from me?" The woman's smile widened. "We want to see what you're made of, human. You carry our blood, whether you like it or not. And with that comes responsibility and power." Power. That word again. The Keeper had spoken of it too, but none of this felt like power. It felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The woman waved her hand, and the room around me began to shift again. This time I was standing in my childhood home, a small, modest house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was night, and the house was eerily silent. The lights were off, casting long, dark shadows across the walls. I knew this place. I had spent years here, but something was wrong. The air felt thick with dread, like something terrible had happened here. And then I heard it, a soft, faint whisper, coming from the upstairs hallway. "Michael." My heart skipped a beat. That voice. It was my mother. I moved slowly toward the stairs, my legs feeling like lead. The closer I got to the hallway, the stronger the whisper became. "Michael, help me!" I reached the top of the stairs and froze. There, at the end of the hallway, was my mother's bedroom door. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the darkness. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn back and leave this nightmare behind. But something pulled me forward. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty. But then I saw it, a figure standing by the window, bathed in the pale moonlight. It was my mother, but she looked different. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken and hollow, and her skin was as pale as death. "Michael," she whispered, turning to face me. "You left me." I felt a wave of guilt crash over me. No, I didn't. I was just a kid. I couldn't save you." Her eyes narrowed and she took a step toward me. "You abandoned me," she hissed, her voice rising. "You left me to die, and now I'm here, trapped in this nightmare because of you." Her face twisted in anger, and she lunged at me, her hands outstretched. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. But I couldn't move fast enough. She grabbed me by the throat, her grip cold and unyielding. I gasped for breath, my vision blurring as she squeezed tighter. "You let me die!" she screamed, her voice echoing in my ears. Suddenly the room shifted again, and I was back in the cabin. The vampires were watching, their eyes glinting with amusement. "Enough," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "I've had enough. What do you want from me?" The woman smiled, her eyes gleaming. "We want you to see, Michael. We want you to understand that power comes at a cost. You are one of us now, and you must face the consequences." I stared at her, my mind racing. "What consequences? What are you talking about?" The woman's smile faded, and her expression grew serious. "You carry our blood, Michael. That makes you special." I spent the next few hours preparing for the ritual, following the instructions in the diary to the letter. The vampires watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. I couldn't tell if they were amused, curious, or just waiting for me to fail. When everything was ready, I stood in the center of the circle I had drawn on the floor. I held the diary in one hand, the pages open to the ritual, and a small knife in the other. The ritual required a blood sacrifice. My blood. I took a deep breath and pressed the blade to my palm, cutting deep enough to draw blood. As the blood dripped onto the floor, I began to recite the incantation. The air around me grew heavy, thick with energy. The vampires stirred, their eyes glowing as they watched. I could feel their presence pressing down on me, but I kept going, reciting the words over and over. Suddenly, the room exploded with light. The vampires let out a collective hiss, recoiling as the energy surged through the cabin. I could feel the bond between us stretching, weakening. But then, just as I thought I had succeeded, something went wrong. The energy faltered, the light dimming. The vampires began to close in, their eyes filled with hunger. The woman smiled, her fangs gleaming in the dim light. "You failed," she whispered, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "And now, you belong to us." I felt a wave of terror crash over me as the vampires descended upon me, their cold hands wrapping around me. I struggled, but it was no use. They were too strong. As the darkness closed in around me, I realized the truth. There was no escape. The diary, the ritual, it had all been a lie. And now, I was theirs.